we won't go up there, but as we get down to this next road to the left, the very first house that's on the left was built by Daniel and Orlena Bowman. No one lives there now. Beyond that is the home of Gilbert Hilton, father of Maynard Hilton, grandfather of Donald Hilton that you know. Okay? Gilbert married the daughter of Ira. Okay? Gilbert was the son of Ira, had married the daughter of Daniel Bowman. Okay? So their home is halfway between Ira Hilton's home and Daniel Bowman's home, up this road. That first house that you see was the Daniel Bowman home. That's where Luther and Carsey lived first before Luther Bowman built this next house right here on the road. So that house eventually became the Wyatt Slusher home. That's where Donald Slusher and Ed Slusher, Ed husband to Lois, our oldest church member, I believe. Is she oldest? Catherine Weeks is oldest, but one of our oldest living members, her husband Ed, and Donald, husband to Alida Reed, whose home was just back beyond the Bond store as we were coming up from the Christopher Slusher home place. So if you think about it, Daniel Bowman's home, the Gilbert Hilton house, and beyond that the Ira Slusher house, they would arrange at a particular time in the afternoon, that was before telephones, to go out, and Selena would wave to her mother, Orlena Bowman, everything's good, and go out and wave to Ira up at the next house, everything's good. And so they were keeping, they're halfway between each of their parents, letting each other know everything's fine. Weren't texting every every hour. Okay, again, this land, much of this land was Daniel Bowman's land, obviously, by the time of the building of the meeting house here that was begun in 1902. And then by 1903, we had the dedication, and Jeremiah Slusher, whom I'll talk about just a little bit more later, to show you essentially where his connection comes in. Jeremiah Slusher was 83 years old at the dedication of the original meeting house here in 1903. He died in 1904 while he was on a preaching mission. He preached in Floyd and Carroll and Grayson counties, Virginia, in Ashe and Surrey and other counties in North Carolina. And he would travel by horseback on his horse, Old Sealam. And it was often said that people would remark, "Yonder comes Uncle Jerry on Old Sealam." And Old Sealam was even mentioned in the obituary, because everyone, when they saw Jeremiah Slusher going by, it was always on Old Sealam, who knew the trails, who knew the roads, and it is said that Uncle Jerry would often fall asleep, but Old Sealam knew his way home. Okay, we'll go in, and we'll go in fairly quickly, take your break, get some water, come back, because we only have about 45 minutes left. As we get back on the road, imagine that there were not trees here when the first Laurel Branch meeting house or church was built. Again, land given by by Daniel and Orlena Bowman. Gilbert Hilton and his wife, who was daughter of Daniel, had sawed the lumber from trees on his property, and their daughters had packed the lumber that was used in building the first meeting house. Now, you could look through and see where this brick house is now, that after the Harmon School closed, those children came to the Laurel Branch School. Okay, and there is, I think, let's see, do we have the picture of your dad in a picture of the Laurel Branch School? No, I don't have it in your booklet, but yes, Carrie Keith was one of the individuals who went to school. The school was located where this brick house is. Now, eventually, starting back there as we came out from the church, this land was the land of David Slusher, son of Christopher. So we've talked about Elizabeth, who married Solomon Harmon, his daughter, Mary Ann, who married Burrell Hilton. Now we're talking about his son, David. And from here until I tell you next was the land that belonged to David. All right, David's descendants come down to Lewis Hamilton, then to Harvey Slusher, then to Will Slusher, then to Bud Slusher, who is married to Betty. Now, if you look down there at the little curved work building behind their home, can you see the bell that is outside of that building? That's the Laurel Branch School's bell. Bud said that his dad used the Laurel Branch School after it was no longer a school when the Floyd High School, that was what is now the nucleus for the Floyd Elementary School, when the Floyd High School was built, this was no longer used, the Laurel Branch School. All right, Bud's dad, Will Slusher, used that building for a time to store hay and so forth. And in Bud's words, said they saw that boys were coming over the weekends and smoking and drinking and swarping around in there, and he's afraid it was going to burn it down. So he just took it down, saved the bell, and Bud put it up there before their children were born, so that when Betty was pregnant, she could ring the bell if she needed to call him in from the fields. Now, going up this road and continuing, if you continued straight, you'd be going over Low Gap. That takes you to Indian Valley. So I'm thinking that's where the fellow from Indian Valley came, and he was going along by Asa Harmon's, I think on the way to Magdalen and Daniel Spangler's with little Preston Cox, if you can picture it. We also know that going over Low Gap was the way that individuals from this area took their empty wagons to go to Christiansburg, to the railroad depot over there to get goods, because it would cut off 4 miles. Coming back, though, they'd come the Christiansburg Pike through what is now Floyd, and it was about a 21-mile trip, but they could cut off 4 miles going over. But they said the horses couldn't pull it up coming back through Low Gap.
I'm excited.
Did you know that? Did you hear Darlene? Darlene designed the new sign for the new Topeka Cemetery, and Carrie Keith and Jack, her husband, were the ones who built that brick sign for the new Topeka Cemetery back in the 1960s. Did you know that? She said she did know that. Okay, wonderful. Thank you for sharing. Absolutely. That's another new thing I've learned. Okay, so as we come through here, again, this land on both sides along the little Huckleberry Creek, very small tributary to West Fork, but that's the little Huckleberry Creek flowing through here. And this land then became the land of Lewis Hamilton, David's son. And if you look as we are nearing the curve, and you'll see at the end of this field a log building. That log building that you see to your right was the log kitchen of the Lewis Hamilton Slusher home. Now, I believe that that home was also the home of David and Nancy Cox Slusher. Everything seems to fit as far as the deeds and passing of land. David died before Nancy. Nancy married her first cousin, Luke Cox. Both of them had their sets of children. In their marriage agreement, they agreed that at their deaths, what they had coming into the marriage went to each of their separate children. Now, this building that is still standing was the log kitchen. We know it was the log kitchen of at least Lewis Hamilton Slusher's home. Normally, you would expect that the kitchen is going to be the building that burns and the house stands, but the opposite occurred. The Lewis Hamilton Slusher home burned, but that building, which was the original log kitchen, is still standing. Yes, that log building right there was the log kitchen. Now, one can guess that perhaps David had built that, and that was their first, just like with Solomon and Elizabeth, was probably their first home before building their bigger home as their family grew. I don't know the exact location. I don't know if any of the Belchers were able to determine or see a foundation, but at least somewhere close right there, since that was the log kitchen, which usually would have been just within a few feet, 10 feet or so of the home, somewhere right in there would have been the David Slusher, Lewis Hamilton Slusher home. All right, Lewis Hamilton's son Harvey built this next home. He married Julia Bishop, daughter of Asa Bishop, who married Elizabeth Dodd. Think end of Laurel Branch Road, Sauter's Supermarket, Dodd's Creek. Okay, so Elizabeth Dodd, daughter of Dodd's Creek, and Julia married Harvey Slusher, son of Lewis Hamilton Slusher. So again, a descendant of Christopher Slusher, Christopher David Lewis Hamilton Harvey. Just very quickly, he married Julia Bishop, who was daughter of Asa Bishop, as I said, who married Elizabeth Dodd. Now, Asa Bishop was literally across the hill from my great-grandfather, Oliver Perry Slusher. He named one of his sons Asa Slusher, Harvey Slusher. And Harvey, father of Will, who is father of Bud, husband of Betty, of our congregation. Also, Harvey, father of Fanny Jones, one of the leading figures if you look at Laurel Branch's church history. Fanny and her husband, Flem Jones, important early leaders of the Laurel Branch Church congregation. And we'll see their home very shortly. In fact, when you looked at the home that Will Slusher built, where Bud and Betty live now, and we see the home of Flem and Fanny, you'll see that they are the same construction. And Will laughed and he says, of course, mine's the built more, because we built more onto it, but it was using the same floor plan. Okay, now the younger son of Harvey's had inherited the house and land up the hollow. Now, from what I understand, and this is Bud's story, but I'm going to share it even though it's being taped. And he said, now, he was married to a mean old woman, and she wouldn't divorce him. So he stopped paying taxes and was willing for it to be the house and the land to be sold on the courthouse steps. And that's when Stephen Douglas Bond bought it. And he was willing to sell it if he kept 10 acres at the upper end of the hollow and the little house. That's what happened. And she left. And according to Bud, his uncle was happy thereafter. That's Bud's story for the family. But that's how that property then came to be in Stephen Douglas' bond, and then later his daughter Ava, who married Paul Belcher, who are Rob's great-grandparents. No, grandparents, right. Paul and Ava would be great. Right, would be SD was great. Okay, we can head on up. Now, as we go on up to the top of the hill, you can look, and we can move on fairly quickly now. We're going to have to. You can look at the upper end, the little house. In fact, Glenna Weddle shared when she was on the tour here that her family lived in this little house for a short period of time. It's the one just past the fence, and you'll look through the trees right at the upper end of this valley, and when you see the little house down in the dip just past the fence, that's the little house where Bud's uncle was happy to spend his days, no longer dealing with what he called his mean old wife. Okay. All right. Mr. Luther Bowman was sharing information about this area back in 1993. And one of the things that he shared in the conversation was, it won't be many years until there won't be anybody that will know a lot of these things. And that's one of the things that prompted me to be doing what I am right now, of gathering the information and sharing it so that people will know about these things. One of the things he shared, and I'll point out, when you look across this first knoll, you'll see on the next knoll the Slusher Jones Cemetery. That's where Fanny and Flem Jones and others of Harvey Slusher's descendants and families are buried.
And I've done the funeral services of
Yes.
Silas and his wife.
Yes.
And because I'm a younger generation, it took me a bit to understand the connection of the Joneses with the Slushers.
Okay.
But I've been privileged to do their services.
That's
in that
wonderful.
cemetery.
And one of the things that Mr. Luther shared was that just beyond that cemetery across the knoll, someone had told Flem Jones that that was good soil for brick. And so J. Allen Altizer, Jim Altizer's dad, built a brick kiln for Flem Jones on the other side of this knoll. In Little Huckleberry Creek flowing down through there, there was enough water to mix the clay and form the bricks, and they had the kiln. And it's my understanding that you had to be careful and keep the fire going just right. If you got it too hot, that wasn't good. If you didn't get it hot enough, that wasn't good. So it was pretty much that it was a social gathering when it was time to fire the kiln for the brick. And so people of the community would come maybe through the night, bringing their musical instruments and just making an evening of it. And if you go to the building that houses El Charro, it's my understanding that there are 2 rows of brick. The outer row that are Salem brick, but the inner row of that building were made of Jones brick. And the kiln eventually fell in, and Flem didn't rebuild it. Now, out this road, Slutcher Grant Lane, we'll be going out there for our baptism later on this afternoon at 5. You'll see the signs there. And you'll see the home of Jacob Slusher, father of Jeremiah Slusher. Now, this is where we talk a little bit more about Jeremiah. Jeremiah, son of Christopher, had joined, well, many of these individuals, all these individuals were going to the brick church. So in 1868, after the Civil War, he entered the ministry. 1878, he was ordained as an elder. And at that point, he began preaching in the Slusher School, which we're going to be coming to over the hill here, the location. And the people of this area who up to that point simply had to walk all of the distance. Now think how far we've come since Topeka, to walk to church on Sunday mornings. Now his father, Jacob, my great-great-grandfather, is now owning this land. Since back there at Flem and Fannie Jones' house in Slusher Grant Lane, this land was Jacob's land. And so if you look down where it's cleared down through here, and when I say here, I'll be pointing out where the Slusher School was that Jacob built in 1840. According to according to school history in the county, it was the first school building to be built specifically for the purpose of being a school, as opposed to having school meeting in other buildings that had already built for other purposes. So as you look down to your left right now, down in the little valley, you can still see a cleared area. They keep that mowed through there. That was the location of the Slusher School. And that was where the road went too. No road up here. Okay? So Jeremiah started preaching for the people of this Laurel Branch area in that school. Now think about where, and we're going to pause right here. There's a vehicle that wants to pass, but if we can pause, and you can look at the front of your notebook. Good. All right, look at the top here. You see where I've done a dotted line that sort of forms a hypotenuse for a kind of triangle? Okay, over on the left is the spot where we were at the Christopher Slusher house. Okay, come along the dotted line and we're right where this road comes out. Okay, actually it's not this driveway, but we couldn't stop back there. It's the driveway that now has a gate across it. But you can, essentially, this is where we are now. We've come around learning the history to get to this point. All right, Jeremiah's house was about halfway between Christopher's house and the location of the Slusher School. Okay? Harvey Slusher taught at the Slusher School, was one of the teachers. Again, this is Jacob Slusher land. Going out Slusher Grant Lane was the first home of Jacob Slusher. It is still standing. It's the first house that you see after going down a little dip and across and up another dip, and you see it to your right out in the field. He's the one who moved to Christopher's home to care for Eva and Christopher. Okay, then after Christopher died, he came back to this land, and we can move on now, Mike, and he built the, all right, this, while we're talking Christopher, this is all that remains of his home site. This is the chimney of the Jeremiah Slusher home place. You can see where it had the curved top with the, say the word stone, the keystone in the center. And Paul Jones, who owned the land then, sold that to someone who wanted it for their home. But this is still standing going up that road. You have to get there walking or on a four-wheeler, which is how Kevin and I got there to take this picture. Okay, looking to your left, the big red barn was built by Jacob about 1845. You know, after his dad died and he came back down to this land. That house I was telling you about out Slusher Grant Lane was then was first the home of Jeremiah after Jacob went to Christopher's, and then Jeremiah's son Bennett Slusher. But this was also a threshing barn. Now we could pause right here, and you see that sheds have built to the side of it, to the left, to the front, and to the far side. My Uncle George Slusher, the shed to this side was his milking parlor. The shed to the back, as you can see, it was added for equipment and also for storage of hay. that is a beautiful barn. As a young girl, teenager, working for my Uncle George, packing square bales of hay in the loft, sweaty and hot, I did appreciate the beauty of the mortise and tenon peg joinery of that barn, built in 1845. To go in it, I still, it's just beautiful, and is sturdy and standing since 1845. Okay, we can move on now. Actually, that was in the background of the picture that you see that appeared in the Citizens Telephone flyer. Of course, they were showing the phone line, but that's the barn in the background. The second home of Jacob Slusher, which he built in 1845, is no longer standing. My Uncle George Slusher eventually was living there. His 4 children had just been born, were born. His 4th child, Jane, was very young at the time. If you go up this little plantation road and see the big tree and imagine a house standing just this side of the big tree, that's where Jacob Slusher's second home was. And you can see a map that it was drawn that says Jacob Slusher on the map. And you also see school, you also see Jerry Slusher, you also see Attaway. Okay, now Attaway was daughter of Jeremiah's brother, Francis Marion Slusher. Go down Weddell Road to Edna's home, for Edna lives in the house which Francis Marion Slusher built. Francis Marion Slusher, father of Attaway. When Attaway married the son of Jeremiah, yes, she married her first cousin. Okay, so she was going from Francis Marion's up the road near where the road comes out to the Slusher School. So you can see the map which was drawn by one of her descendants. This is a picture of Attaway as you see it listed there. And those of you in our Laurel Branch congregation, this is beautiful Attaway that I'll be portraying tomorrow morning, and Jim is going to be Jeremiah. So you'll get a good laugh at least. All right, now we've come to that next bridge, which meant that the land to this point was all Slusher land. Now, from right here to the top of the ridge was Terman land for a time. Matthew Terman, his son Elijah Terman, married Barbara Slusher, daughter of Christopher Slusher. Okay? So this was Terman land for a time, but eventually was purchased by my grandfather, so that now all of the land that you see to your left was land that my father had purchased from his father, and the nuclear part over that ridge has been in the land, has been in the family since 1802 for Christopher, to Jacob, to Oliver Perry, to George William, to Freeman Morris, to Janet, to Kevin. Unbroken lineage. So it is a Virginia Century Farm, as you'll see the sign up here at their yard. The state of Virginia gives recognition to any family farm that has been continually farmed by a family for over 100 years. Of course, this for some 215 years. Now, as you're looking up the valley to see the house, that is Francis Marion Slusher. We mentioned that the brethren did not believe in slavery. The brethren were conscientious objectors. In minutes of the Brethren Church, there is the record of the request that brethren not be made to serve, that they not be made to bear arms. It was finally approved by the state of Virginia that they could pay $500 and 2% of all tangible property and not have to serve. So there were individuals who scraped up the money and did that. And then when we came to have the Confederate government step in and put another $500 on top of that, if you wish to avoid the conscription by the Confederate government. So it's at that point that we have individuals within the Brethren Church who attempted, some of them, to pay it and stay home. Others who were conscripted into service. We know that Francis Marion went, but with the determination that he would not take another life. It is said that he had another in his sights which he knew was aiming at him. And so in his mind, is he going to pull the trigger? Remember, this is Attaway's father. She's a baby, barely 2 at the time. And when he was ready to pull the trigger, as he's thinking, okay, do I pull the trigger against my belief so I can go home to my wife and children, or do I not pull the trigger and surely die? At that moment, he was hit in the hip by a mini ball shot by someone else. And so he remained in the hospital, and we have some of his letters among Essie Stallings, a descendant. She has the collected letters. This is the house and barn that my parents built in 1949. This is where I grew up, and this is where Kevin and Missy Keith live now with their children, Colton and Michaela. Now, right here to the right of their yard fence, this knoll, is where Matthew Terman, who married Archelaus Hilton's daughter, okay, Archelaus, son of Elijah, all right, and their son Elijah Terman married Barbara Slusher, daughter of Christopher, okay. So he had a mill up West Fork, all right. Francis Marion, when he came home from the Civil War, ran that mill, okay. So the Terman Mill became the Harmon Mill. Let me mention to you something about a sawmill and how it would be different from a mill that would be grinding grain. A sawmill, and the Asa Harmon Mill was this type of mill, was called a sash mill, which meant it went up and down to saw lumber, okay, to saw log into lumber. Okay, this is Lester behind us right now. When if you know the song Turkey in the Straw, okay, Turkey in the Straw, okay, all right, there is a chorus that says, came to the river and I couldn't get across, so I paid $5 for an old blind horse. He wouldn't go forward and he wouldn't stand still, so he went up and down like an old sawmill. And they're making reference to the sash type sawmill. Just throw that in because I just thinking about the mill. Okay. All right, we can head on now. Oh yeah, turkey in the straw and a hey hey hey, turkey in the straw and a hee haw haw. Okay. All right. Now this is from here on to Slaughter Supermarket was pretty much Bishop land. Originally Dodd, but he married Elizabeth Dodd, so Bishop land. In fact, his son Harvey had his home. You see the stump of a walnut tree below that row of walnut trees? That's where Harvey's home was. That's fine. That row of walnut trees is there because it grew up in the bottom row of the fence of Mother and Daddy's garden. Can you imagine me growing up having to walk all that way to the garden? Why'd they put that garden all the way up here? Later, as I grew to realize that, okay, down there in the flat it gets too wet, it made sense that they put it where it was. But you can still see the foundation stones of the Harvey Bishop home. Okay, we're going to have to really move. We've got 4 minutes to get us back to Topeka. So this is going to be, yeah, all right. So we're just not going to stop, and I'll tell you as much as I can. Okay, we know that Stoneman, George Stoneman, Civil War, came through the area April 3rd, 1865, with approximately, say, 3,000 cavalry. They had come up from North Carolina. He had sent some on up over in toward, say, well, in Carroll County area, was coming to go down the Christiansburg Pike to go over to the Cambria train station. They were destroying train tracks. And on the way, had to find enough food for all their horses and the men. And so they were raiding smokehouses and spring houses and barns and exchanging horses, sometimes writing receipts that they had done so, sometimes not necessarily. So as we're getting up here, you remember me mentioning Doug Spur Road? Well, Doug Spur Road is mentioned of being along up here as well. So some of the men may have divided and come down Doug Spur Road, others coming down the Pike. But this road is the other end of the Rose Hill Road that is just next to the Falling Branch Road on 221, and I'll point it out. I'm mentioning it because this is Bishop land. Asa Bishop was away at war, he and his son Burdine. Harvey was younger, he was still at home. When Stoneman's men came through, one of the men came into the house and asked for the keys to the smokehouse and the spring house, and Elizabeth Bishop said, "I've lost them." Yeah, okay, we'll just kick the doors down. Well, she reached into her apron pocket and supplied the keys. And if you look in the Floyd County, Virginia Heritage book, it's the big green book that was done approximately 20 years ago, the story that Fanny Jones' daughter recounts hearing told that they remembered all of those men bivouacking in the flat bottoms. So as we go by Slaughter's, look down to your left and across, and as we're going back up toward Falling Branch, all of the flat bottoms would have been filled with soldiers bivouacking the night of April 3rd. Now, this barn on your left was built in 1854 by Asa Bishop. His home was somewhere up on the ridge to your left. I don't know exactly where. I've not been over to the cemetery, but the cemetery is also located over there. I think they would have probably been going up or down on the other side of the hill to the house. At any rate, when Stoneman's men came through, they set up cannons up on that ridge, pointed toward Jacksonville, toward the courthouse. There weren't trees there such that the people could go up to the top of the then Floyd Courthouse, which was located where the current one is, and look this way and see the cannons that were pointed toward Jacksonville. So when they saw the cannons starting to move down Bishop Hill, Callahil Stiggleman, who was the highest ranking of the Confederate soldiers here in the county at the time, and he was also a doctor, he was Dr. Callahil Stiggleman, rode out with a white handkerchief to surrender Jacksonville so that it would not be burned. His home is the home directly across from Circle K, where you may get your gas, right beside Hardee's. Now it's right beside Hardee's. That was the Callahill-Stiglman home. And it is said that perhaps George Stoneman actually had a meal and perhaps himself may have spent the night in the Callahill-Stiglman house. At any rate, it was not burned. Now, you're imagining all of these flat bottoms filled with the bivouac tents of George Stoneman's Federal Army cavalry moving through. And the story was that they could hear the singing of the soldiers down here from their home atop the hill up there. Okay, as we move on up, we're also coming to Rose Hill Road. Rose Hill, so named because it was the home of Jacob Helms. Jacob Helms was described by some as the bank of Floyd County about that time period, and because he's the one who loaned out money by that time. By that time, we're getting to the 1830s, 1831s, thereabout, when Floyd County was separating from Montgomery County. And Jacob Helms wanted the courthouse to be up here on Rose Hill Road near his house. And he was important in his community, and that's where he wanted it. Well, George Sowers down near the Spangler Mill in that area, same kind of individual for his community, and they could not agree. Okay, it comes to the point that the legislature of Virginia says, look, if you all don't decide where you're going to put your courthouse, we'll decide for you. So we have Fleegers and Tices who step in, who own adjoining land that met about where the stoplight is. And we can say the stoplight. And so they gave the land for the building of where the courthouse could be built. They gave a lot, kept a lot for themselves, which they could sell to make the money, gave another lot for the town, etc., etc. Basically, the only family living in that particular area were the Kittermans. And their family cemetery was what is now the old Jacksonville Cemetery, right there across, in the center of Floyd, across from El Charo and in that area, Farmers Market area. Okay, so why there? Because it was equidistant from George Sowers to Jacob Helms, equidistant to right there. And actually, that's where the pike was crossing as well, you know, and so the coming together and these two civic-minded citizens giving the land, and that's why we have the courthouse and the town of Floyd, where we do today. And when you all got your driver's license, if you didn't have automatics and had to stop there going uphill and prayed that the light was going to be green and you didn't have to stop and didn't have to change gears. That's my experience. Yeah, there's the Rose Hill Road, and I showed you where it came out on the other end. Here's Falling Branch. You have a picture in your booklet going down to Falling Branch. People of the community would go there for Easter sunrise services and social gatherings. It's hard to get to it now. There have been trees that have fallen, brush grown up, etc. A few of you, like me, might remember that right here is where our drive-in theater was located, right there in that flat area. That's where I saw Greatest Show on Earth and Gone with the Wind and a whole bunch of Gene Autry and Roy Rogers movies. Okay, we're now coming to the two-room Falling Branch School, which became the home of Henry B. and Maud Schuler, and it is up on the hill here to right behind you back there. Now, the original one-room school was moved to right up here on your left. Mr. Sheeler used his steam engine and pulled the building from that site to the site up here on your right, because they had learned that there were going to be too many children to house in this one-room school. So they built that two-room school by the next school session, and that became the two-room Falling Branch School. Mr. Dwight Sheeler has done much of the restoration of that Falling Branch School. Over here was the home of Sue Jefferson Sheeler. She was a Sheeler and married a Sheeler. She was a school teacher. She wrote the history Pioneer Coats of Arms of Floyd County. You can find it in the Floyd Public Library. She called her home Sylvan, S-Y-L-V-A-N, Sylvan Hill. That was her home. Okay, so we're now on Sheeler property. We're coming down to the home many of you knew, Nola Sheeler Albert, whose home here on the right, your right, it was her family home. It was also the site of the Amos post office. Inside, she proudly would show the drop-off box and the fact that this is where you had to go to the location of the post office. There was not rule-free delivery. You know, people were willing to have a post office in their home or in their store to accommodate, but you had to go there to get your mail. There wasn't real free delivery at the time. Her father was a man who sharpened saw blades for sawmills and had his work out in a shed. And she said that they would ask him, well, why do you have me out here? Isn't it too cold? And he says, well, if it's too cold to sharpen a blade, it's too cold to be outside or to be doing anything. And that's the sawmill. He did lots of tongue and groove. Much of the early tongue and groove that you see in Floyd County homes would have been sawed at that sawmill. Here was the Huff Cannery. Many individuals found work during World War II. And Edna Weddle was one of them, as was Glenna Weddle, picking beans for the canning at the cannery there. Tomatoes and cabbage and green beans. I know that my uncle Ron Slusher had special gum boots. It was his job to get into the vat of cut cabbage and stomp it in his clean gum boots to make sauerkraut to be canned there at the cannery. Right up here is I failed to point it out, the West Fork Primitive Baptist Church. Here is Zionia, the home of Archie Vaughn. His father, Dennis Vaughn, had his law office in the little building back behind the home there. We're also coming up to Midway Grocery, and it was originally Wildwood, and you see pictures of it in your notebook. John Thompson Harmon had built Wildwood, not that Wildwood, but when we're coming up here to Midway Grocery. And it was originally, and this is where Edna grew up. Her father, in fact, built the house that is directly across the road from the current Midway Grocery. And this was the time that people were just beginning to get out and travel beyond just the necessary travel. So you will see two little cabins, approximately 10 by 10 feet size. One of them has since fallen down just in the last year, but one is still standing. He built 10 back behind his red and white log Wildwood location, and you can see that right there is the fallen one, and you can see the one still standing, and this was his home. Now, John Thompson Harmon was father of Margaret Harmon, who was clerk of the county, and Margaret married C.W. Harmon. Okay, so Margaret Harmon O.N. married C.W. Harmon A.N., and their son, Alan Harmon, now runs the C.W. Harmon Farm Center. So there's the connection. Margaret told of growing up here, and if you look at the picture of Wildwood, you'll see that it's pump. You know, you pumped the gas up to the top, and you'd see whether you had a gallon or 2 gallons or whatever. It was Margaret and her brother's job to pump the gas up for individuals. She also told of having sugar cookies in there, and also wheel of cheese, and people would come in, get 2 cookies, cut off a slice of cheese, and make a sandwich. You know, that was how they made a meal. She said she well remembered when a fellow came by selling sliced bread. He was from a company called the Rainbow Bread Company, and she could remember when that occurred. And John Thompson Harmon is the one who built the brick house back there. All right, I mentioned to you David Weddle, oldest son of Benjamin. All right, the location of David Weddle's home was down here on your left. The house is not standing, and the home that is there now was the home of a descendant, Molly Thompson, who ran a school for girls there in that house. And her niece was Nancy Gillespie, Nancy Harmon Gillespie, who lived there. Her daughter, Margaret, was a basketball star in my sister's class, graduated in 1960. Okay, so we're coming to C.W. Harmon Farm Center, and for those of you who might not know, just past the parking area of C.W. Harmon Farm Center is the Weddle Cemetery up on your left, and that is where Anna Maria Eiler Weddle, and a stone noting that Benjamin Weddle was buried at Bent Mountain. When you go in that cemetery, you'll see that the lines aren't perfectly straight. Some explanation is that there were chestnut trees there, and their roots made it difficult to dig graves. Others, that during diphtheria epidemic, maybe the mother had to go dig the grave of her husband, or the wife had to dig the grave, and would put enough dirt so that later neighbors would come and plant and put more dirt. Up this hollow was where Catherine Slusher, who married Carrie Simmons had the Simmons Mill. Catherine, daughter of Christopher. So you can see the Christopher Slusher connections that I'm aware of. Now, as we're coming around here, we're going to tie in J.A.L. Sutphin again. J.A.L. Sutphin, a teacher and principal, had the he gave the name to the Mount Sterling School, I understand. And it was at the Mount Sterling School that Topeka had its first Sunday school classes. Interestingly, they would bring individuals up to the school for the classes, and they finally decided that it really made more sense to just take the benches down to the church and have the Sunday school at the church. But at the Mount Sterling School, if you look to your right, the red building, the central portion of it, was the Mount Sterling School, and you see a picture of it in your booklet. It's near the back. You see J.A.L. Sutphin standing there in the center. Notice the kids who are up on top of the building. Wonder if J.A.L. knew it when they were taking the pictures. My guess is that he did not. All the kids from that school were released on the day that Creed Hilton, the slave of Elijah, also a beloved individual in this community. All of the community were going to his burial at the old Topeka Cemetery. He was the last to be buried there. And individuals from the community were going, and they released school. And all the children from the Mount Sterling School walked to the Topeka Cemetery for the burial of Creed Hilton. And now we're back to Topeka.